and welcome to History Between the Lines. This episode will be talking about motorsport and its promotion by the fascist regimes of Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany during the 1920s and the 1930s. And here to discuss this with me is Dr. Mario Draper. Mario is a senior lecturer in British and European history at the University of Kent. Mario, hello.
Hi, Jonathan. Nice to be here.
It's good to have you. Good to have you. So, if we just begin with the state of Grand Prix racing, the thing that would eventually evolve into Formula One post Second World War, what was its position before the creation of the fascist regimes in Italy in 1922 and Germany in 1933?
So, motor racing is the brand new thing, right? The automobile has, by the turn of the century into the early 1900s, has become much more widely available, albeit still to those with money, and very quickly, rather than just being a mode of transport. People are wanting to race these things. And initially, races are between the big cities of Europe, open road races. But as time progresses, you start getting road circuits where cars will do laps, but usually these things are 20, 30, 40 kilometers long. And over time, this becomes more and more regularized until you get purpose-built circuits. The first Grand Prix proper, the French Grand Prix, is run in 1906 near Le Mans for its first running. So motorsport is big. It's increasing in popularity. It draws big crowds, many of whom have never really seen a car in action. And with it comes all sorts of ideas of modernity, of excitement. People are interested in the cars, but then they're also interested in the drivers who dare to race them.
And from the very beginning, politics and nationalism is completely infused with Grand Prix racing. Because to give just one example, in 1922, just before Mussolini took power in Italy, at the French Grand Prix, one of the guests of honour was Maginot, the then French war minister, and the German teams weren't even invited. Grand Prix back then had just become invitational. Certain national teams weren't allowed to compete. So this is but one example of how nationalistic from the beginning motorsport was.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see this, dating back to the early Grand Prix in 1906. The French are very proud of the fact that they have the Grand Prix and clearly want French cars and French drivers to win, because this is the era of national colours for cars, right? This is where the French get their blue, the German cars run in white, British racing green is developed, and obviously the Italian cars are racing in red. So absolutely, politics, nationalism hugely embedded within motor racing, as each nation is trying to prove that it has a leg up on the opposition in terms of its progress, its industrialization, its ability to organize and host and be the center of attention of this brand new motorsport arena in every way, shape, or form, right? That you cut this. Motorsport is the kind of golden child of sport and of nationalism.
And it just has connections to the military side of every country, being all about technology, being about the automotive industry. So in a way, it's almost from the beginning, it's seen as some sort of substitute battlefield for actual war.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right to point out the technology side of things. War is a great, advancer of technology, as we know, but so is sport. And in this, you have the two that go hand in hand, particularly, after the First World War, where mechanization of armies, that feeds very clearly into the immediate post-war industrial kind of rush. At the same time, it's interesting that you mentioned there, Jonathan, the kind of links between the actual battlefield and that being transposed onto a different field, in this case sport. And you see this with all sports, right? With the Olympics, with international football, but also particularly with motor racing, and the drivers, because of their proximity to death and danger,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's a real clear link between, the fallen of the Great War and the fallen in motor racing.
So, with these kind of features of motorsport, aggressive nationalism, the desire for victory, and all of its links to the military, I think it was almost inevitable that fascism would become very attracted to auto racing. They would definitely have a natural affinity for it, and they would want motorsport as their own, for them to control both the industry and the sport and all of the national teams who are competing within it. They see this as one of their arenas, effectively, to ignite the fascist imagination around war, technology, and just their ideals, just how they think society should be run. But if we begin with fascist Italy, so I think the first big step to fascism attempting to take over is the death of Antonio Ascari in the early 1920s, I think.
1925 French Grand Prix. Yeah.
And his funeral, they pulled out all the stops. The amount of pomp, the amount of articles that were written about him in fascist newspapers, the propaganda machine of Mussolini's government went into overdrive for this. Mussolini himself sent a wreath, which was carried on Ascari's coffin, and as it travelled back to Italy for his funeral, thousands lined the way and thousands attended his funeral. So this was the first big step towards the fascists saying motorsport is ours.
Yeah, and Antonio Ascari, father, by the way, of Alberto Ascari, who becomes double Formula One world champion in the early 50s. Just for those who are interested, he was the racer of the time, contemporaries with other famous names, famous drivers who later become team owners. Again, for those interested in modern Formula One, Enzo Ferrari was a driver around the same time, but Ascari is the one who's winning all of the big prizes, and he embodies something really interesting for new fascist Italy, because he is seen as a bit of a daredevil. And so there is a kind of cult of personality that we recognize very clearly with Mussolini, but it's someone who the fascist regime can get behind, this cult of personality. But equally, he's then mastering this new technology as well. So this plays really into futurist ideas of fascist Italy, of marrying man and machine and creating the new man, the new Italian fascist. And Ascari's death is a big tragedy, not just personally, not just for the Alfa Romeo team that he drives for. And what's really interesting about his death is, like you say, this propaganda machine that kicks into action really quickly. This is not the first Italian driver to die at the hands of a racing car. It is the first Italian driver to really be absorbed into the fascist narrative. And the similarities between the kind of procession for the Italian unknown soldier and that of Antonio Ascari, as his coffin is kind of brought back to Italy and then paraded through Italy, is really interesting, really symbolic. And again, it's all about fascism claiming control of the narrative, right? And the war, is very clearly important to the birth of fascism, and the way in which this is all choreographed and staged to look very much like the unknown soldier is telling, I think, and it really does bring to the fore how much motorsport is and the hero worship around its drivers and the team of Alfa Romeo is going to play a part.
And I should say as well, when Ascari is killed, the fascist propaganda, there's definitely not much sadness or sympathy in Ascari's death in and of itself, and they do this for other Italian drivers after they're killed whilst on the racetrack. Materassi is another example. I
Yeah.
think he dies at Monza in
28.
1928.
Yeah.
They see them as martyrs. They see them as having died for something that's worth dying for, which is progression towards new technology, towards winning, just towards victory, just winning the race and furthering the triumphs of the Italian national teams, Alfa Romeo being obviously the top dog at this
Yeah.
time. But again, that's the fascist idea of the end entirely justifies the means, in that they don't feel any sympathy or sadness for the driver himself being killed. It's all about what's achieved at the end, and this obviously comes into their policy around war as well. They don't care how many soldiers get sacrificed. It's victory at the end that matters
Yeah.
for them, and it's the
Yeah.
same here.
Yeah, absolutely. And just, with the coverage of these deaths, starting with Ascari, the kind of final words kind of said about them in newspapers and newsreels and everything, is basically, presente. It's, standing to attention for, the cause of fascism. Like you say, it's very much ends justifying means. They did this in pursuit of victory and furthering Italy. There is no sadness or remorse. There is only glory.
The rivalry between Teseo Nuvarali and Achille Varsi became a classic example of this. First of all, the fascist love of rivalry between two Italian drivers, and again, the fascist government proclaimed them as perfect examples of the kind of man they wanted all Italians to be like.
Yeah.
So what was this rivalry like between the two of them? And this is moving a bit forward in time. We're kind of the early 1930s by this point.
Yeah. So these two are two of the sporting greats, if you will. Particularly Tazio Nuvolari is considered by Enzo Ferrari himself, named him as probably the greatest driver that he ever worked with, which is some accolade. But these two are very much the embodiment of the new fascist man. They're much more taciturn than some of the drivers that came before them. So there's a sense that, Antonio Ascari or the likes of Giuseppe Campari or Mario Borzacchini, some of the earlier drivers that just preceded Varsi and Nuvolari, or were slightly overlapping contemporaries, they didn't quite fit the image of the new kind of athletic, very kind of straight talking, straight looking kind of individual. There's many more smiles and laughter around. Giuseppe Campari, who dies in 1933, is a lover of opera, and he's a large gentleman, so he doesn't quite fit the mold. Nuvolari and Varsi, very different, right? They are not seen smiling at cameras quite the same way. They're much more, like I say, taciturn in their complexion. They're very athletic, but also they come from slightly different, or they're cut from different cloths. Nuvolari is the showman. So again, coming back to this cult of personality type thing, Varsi is much more methodical and goes along this other fascist route of being, much more in tune with the technology and much more. So you marry the two together to make the perfect kind of fascist individual. And they are keen rivals with one another on the track and off the track, often competing in the same teams, but often falling out and forcing one or the other out. And their rivalry really comes to a head through the premier fascist Italian race of the era, which isn't a Grand Prix, interestingly enough. The Italian Grand Prix at Monza is obviously a big deal, but the race that really comes to embody fascist Italy is called the Mille Miglia, right? This is a 1,000-mile race run in the tradition of the older city-to-city races. that I spoke about earlier. So this is a race that starts in Brescia in northern Italy, runs 1,000 miles all the way down through Bologna to Rome and back up north in a sort of figure of eight. It takes, the best part of a day to complete. And these two go hammer and tongs at each other through this race, this great race, a couple of times with Nuvolari at first coming out on top, wins it a couple of times. And it sort of sets the scene for the Italian press to big up these individuals who suddenly rise above the importance of the machine. And these two individuals with their rivalry are very much kind of front and center of it. And it helps, of course, that they are hugely successful, and successful with Alfa Romeo initially.
Yeah. It's interesting, Mario, that you talked about how being such different people, both from their backgrounds and from their racing styles, I think that's symbolic of the fact that motorsport was one of the few entities that could weld together these contradictory elements of fascism. Yeah. Because on the one hand, you had the technocratic attitude of you have to be a details man, you've got to be a workaholic, you have to be technically proficient. But on the other side is this sort of do or die, fueled by violence, devil may care kind of attitude. It's, if you like, it's looking forwards and looking backwards. So it's sort of a mythical modernity kind of approach. But by having personalities like these two drivers, motorsport is one of the few arenas where these two contradictory elements can be wedded together perfectly and no contradiction be seen. And I think that's one of the main reasons why fascists promote Grand Prix, auto racing so much whilst they're in power and pour so much money into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And alongside that, as I mentioned earlier, fascism, a lot of it is about modernity and is about order. So while you have these two individuals who embody the technocrat and the devil may care attitude, the fact that fascist Italy is able to organize and run 1,000-mile race on public roads, right, many of which are being resurfaced or new sections of road being added, is showing that progress that the country is making, particularly because this is run in the north of Italy, right, the industrial kind of heartland. And the fact that, through military precision, right, using the military, using police forces, that they can close off these roads and organize it without a hitch, right, is again another element of fascism which they are keen to promote through auto racing. So you've got all the elements coming together perfectly for them.
And this race in northern Italy in particular, again, weds the old and the new, which is what fascism is all about. It puts through the new stuff, which, as you said, Mario, is the race itself and the cars driving on it, which embody the worship of speed, which Futurism obviously is a big advocate of, and by extension fascism. And on the other hand, they're racing around a traditional Italian landscape, sometimes on old roads. So this race as well is a connection between these two things. And with the fascists being able to say, no, they're one now. This is the new Italy. There's no contradiction. Old and new have morphed together, and hurrah for us. Look how well we've organised it. And I think not just the fact that motorsport could maybe clear up some of fascism's ideological problems or its ideological divisions potentially with these backwards and forwards elements that we've just spoken about. I think motorsport also fitted into what Mussolini wanted for the future in Italy, because it's clear that certainly in foreign policy, Mussolini wanted to create a new Roman Empire, and he tried to put that into reality when he invaded Abyssinia in 1936, and obviously after the Second World War began, he tried to invade Egypt, Albania, Greece, and other countries. So he was definitely trying to create a new Roman Empire in the Mediterranean, and within this vision, the auto racing was was to be the new chariot races. The race car drivers are the new gladiators. So this is a sort of latter day version of Roman games, this kind of promotion of Grand Prix.
It is, and it comes back to the speed and the danger element, right? That there are deaths quite frequently in this. These guys are the gladiators, and it's all about speed, right? Records are as important as victory. You don't just want to win, you want to win in the quickest possible time. You want to shatter last year's average speed records, again, for the glory of the new empire. And just to bring this home entirely, the state of the art facilities that are built by the Italians in Tripoli in 1931 at the Millahas circuit are far superior to those of Monza that are built 10 years earlier. But this is to be the showcase of the new Italian empire, right? They hold a Grand Prix in Tripoli for the best part of 10 years before the war begins, and it is an impressive sight in the middle, basically, of a desert. But it shows everything that a new Italian empire is and can be. And a lot of money is poured into it. You see a lot of fascist dignitaries there. The military are there. Marshal Balbo is there to start the race, to hand out trophies, all the pomp and ceremony that goes along with a fascist Italian event is happening, but in Africa. And that's a big deal.
And I think this is certainly a very reciprocal relationship between the Italian fascist regime and Italian motorsport. I think, again, we've talked about their similarities, but not just in their ideals or the style of the races, but the fact that Enzo Ferrari ran his team like a dictator. There were uniforms, there were ranks, there was, the strive for technological superiority. And also, with so much government patronage, Alfa Romeo was able to increase its sales of car products. They were commercially minded as well. This massive lifeline, especially during the Great Depression, when Alfa was forced to effectively give up parts of the company to the government in order to save it from ruin. But on the flip side of that, that allowed the government to fill Alfa Romeo with fascist loyalists who would do their bidding.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I say, the government comes in and helps bail out the struggling company, but at the same time, then the relationship is very much symbiotic in that Alfa Romeo wins for Italy and wins for Mussolini. And you mentioned Enzo Ferrari there, so Alfa Romeo pull out of racing officially as a works factory team, but Enzo Ferrari comes in and offers to run the team for them. Scuderia Ferrari is Team Ferrari, but it's running a lot of Alfa Romeos, and this is where Enzo cuts his teeth as a manager. But as you say, very much the way that he ran that company has very dictatorial elements to it. You don't cross the boss.
And it goes without saying that we talked about how nationalistic auto racing had been from the beginning. The fascist regime, if anything, stokes this nationalism up even more. And again, it was a show of strength. I'm talking internationally here, to show that they were better than France, Britain, and Germany as well. Every other nation was a rival in Grand Prix racing. And on the flip side of this, that Italian drivers were racially superior to drivers from other nations as well. So definitely the racial element of fascism came into play here as well.
The nationalism, the ultra-nationalism is prevalent everywhere you look. It's not particularly well liked that a young German by the name of Rudi Caracciola, who becomes a Mercedes stalwart in the 30s, is already winning prominent races in German machinery in his white Mercedes, including the Mille Miglia in the early 30s. that strikes a chord, quite a negative chord, that the Germans are coming over here winning our races, when realistically what the Italians had been used to doing in the late 20s into the early 30s was going over to places like France and Spain and other places with big Grand Prix races and winning them.
Yeah.
And this is really where the two fascist regimes that we're going to bring together in a second, this is where the one-upmanship really begins. When Hitler comes to power in 1933, it's noted that it is the Italian cars and the Italian drivers that win the German Grand Prix in 1933. And very quickly, Adolf Hitler says that there's 500,000 Reichsmarks available for a German team to produce a competitive car, because we are not having the Italians do that on German soil again.
No. As soon as he comes to power, Hitler makes it quite clear that he's taking a leaf out of Mussolini's book, and he is promoting German motorsport to the hilt completely. And as you said, Mario, he's more than willing to pour in hundreds of thousands of German Reichsmarks into teams like Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union to come up with the goods and to become dominant in Grand Prix, which from 1934 onwards they do. The Italians are knocked off their pedestals. Even before he came to power, Hitler had quite a natural affinity for the automotive industry. He talked about getting a people's car for everyone, which would develop into the Volkswagen Beetle, which incidentally he never delivered. It wasn't built and put into mass production until post-Second World War.
Yeah.
And obviously the building of the autobahns during the 1930s as well, which again, the propaganda machine made a big song and dance about this, the fact that Germany was now connected by these highways. And during Hitler's sort of endless monologues during the Second World War about what he was going to do after the war was finished, he spoke about building these vast road networks across what would then be Germany's racial Eastern Empire in Europe and Ukraine and Russia. And these would be arteries transporting people and goods via cars and trucks to different sections of this new German empire. So the motor industry is big in his mind already, even before he realizes the propaganda potential of all of this.
Yeah, and Hitler, as we know from the Second World War, is often taken in by the idea of technology, and the idea of there potentially being a wonder weapon, and things like that. So, it's no surprise that Hitler is already interested in the automotive industry. Is obviously seen being carted around in Mercedes cars, much like Mussolini is seen riding around in Alfa Romeos and the like. The links are clearly there, and the autobahns are symbolically important. This is where throughout the 30s there are speed records being made by the likes of Auto Union and Mercedes. And in fact, Bernd Rosemeyer, the poster boy, he's killed on a section of the Autobahn trying to obtain a speed record. It's very clear that Hitler is keen to work very closely with the automotive industry. And as soon as it's seen that they can win abroad, win internationally, and get great acclaim for it, then the propaganda machine can really kick in.
Again, as you said, Mario, he offers all of this money to German car manufacturers and German teams to come up with racing cars that, as you said, will dominate auto racing. And Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union become the two main companies that come up with said cars, and they become known as the Silver Arrows. So what kind of made them special in terms of technical proficiency, and how did their rivalry kind of develop from then on?
So initially, 500,000 marks are given to Mercedes to develop a car, but it's very quickly pointed out that, two bullets are better than one. So Auto Union, who are slightly later to the party and are made up of four German car companies kind of well put together in one. That's where you get the four rings that now you see on modern day Audis, Audi being one of the four companies. They also get involved in the game and actually deliver their car slightly earlier than Mercedes. And the real sort of technical innovations, well, the clearest one to see, particularly from an Auto Union point of view, is that unlike all of the other cars of the age, the engine is behind the driver, not in front. So we think about Grand Prix cars basically since the late 50s into the early 60s being mid or rear engined cars. Actually, the forerunner to this is the Auto Union of 1934. So that's a big one. It's a difficult car to drive. It doesn't achieve immediate success. Drivers struggle with it. And actually, the Mercedes team are probably technically a little bit ahead. They've got better road holding. They've got supercharged engines that make a very kind of distinctive sound, but deliver huge amounts of horsepower. And they become the dominant force. They're such kind of low profile cars in comparison to the opposition. The team is set up in such a way that they look after every single aspect of the car, from tire temperatures to developing special fuels. So they're all uniformed as well in a very kind of fascistic kind of sense. It's a real military operation, but it's a big step up from what had gone previously, where effectively you have a few guys, a few garagists, if you will, kind of just working on the cars. This is a proper organized team. Both of them are.
The amateurism of the past is gone.
Is gone. And what's really interesting, you mentioned the term silver arrows. Initially, the Mercedes cars in particular were supposed to be white in their paintwork. But for 1934, there were new regulations which put a weight limit of 750 kilos on the cars. And when the Mercedes cars were scrutinized for the first time to make sure they complied with the rules, they were about 751 kilos. So overnight, the decision was taken actually just to scrape off the white paint of the cars, which brought them under or just within the weight limit. And it revealed then this clear, sort of metallic alloy silver color underneath, which allowed for both them and the Auto Unions to be silver cars. And from there you get the silver arrows that have become synonymous with.
I was about to say they made a brand then.
Precisely. And today's one of today's dominant teams, Mercedes-Benz, still runs its cars in silver, and it's all a legacy of back to 1934.
So again, like Italian fascist ideals, the arena of motorsport completely appeals to what the Nazis like in terms of violence, danger, seeing that as the ultimate expression of human achievement, overcoming adverse danger and being victorious. The best arena for this, in their opinion, being war, but motorsports is definitely still up there in terms of the levels of dangers that are involved, and the fact that the very point of you being there is to win the race and to drive quickly. That very much appeals to them. And the attitude of everything or nothing, do or die, in attitude, effectively, to certain drivers. And we'll discuss him in more detail in a minute, but Richard Seaman is a British racing car driver who ends up racing for Mercedes. And that's his attitude. He's constantly told by race organisers and what have you, you have got to slow down on the racetrack. But that's the Nazi way. It's victory or destruction, which of course is how the regime ended. But that's their ethos: everything or nothing. It's one or the other.
And luckily for them, they produce cars that enable them to win more often than not.
Yeah.
So it really helps them achieve that goal. But they don't just win; they completely annihilate the opposition more often than
Yeah.
not. I mean,
Yeah.
they are laps ahead, they are minutes ahead. You have people like Rudolf Caracciola, who is probably the preeminent German racing driver of the pre-war era, who is known as the Rainmeister. So he is the one guy who seemingly doesn't slow down when it gets wet. And again, this allows for a cult of personality to build up. You've got all sorts of other racing car enthusiasts and drivers who fit the Aryan model. Bernd Rosemeyer, very sort of blonde, blue-eyed. Then you've got someone like Hermann Lang, who is first off a mechanic
Yeah.
at the Mercedes team, but through some test runs actually proves his worth as a driver, and then comes forward as the ordinary, everyday working man, right, who
Yeah.
can come forward and win for the Nazi regime. And he wins the Arvus on the Arvus circuit, which is basically, if you imagine a motorway split by a central reservation and then two loops at the end of it, one of which is hugely banked. This is the Arvus circuit, and it is designed purposefully to be the fastest circuit in the world. And Lang in 1937 wins at Arvus at an average speed, get this, of 162 miles an hour. Average speed, right? That's including pit stops and all sorts. And it's a record that will last for 20 years. Right. So, here is a man, the everyday man, winning in a German machine at record speed on a German circuit, the fastest in the world, defying danger. That do or die attitude. Yeah, like you say, it really is something that is played up, and for the Nazi regime, luckily they win more often than not.
Yeah.
You mentioned Richard Seaman, so he's a really interesting character and does embody this spirit. He comes to prominence in 1936, winning in smaller category racing, and is signed up by Mercedes for 1937. Becomes very much part of the establishment, sets up a life in Germany, marries the daughter of BMW's, the BMW company's owner. So, very much keeping it within the family. There's a lot of rehabilitation, I think, done after the war, as there is with a lot of Nazi kind of sympathizers, whereby it's difficult to absolutely categorically work out how involved or how much these individual drivers believed in the Nazi regime. Very clearly, if you look at newsreels of victories and stuff, Caracciola, von Braukitsch, even Seaman, when he wins the German Grand Prix in 37, is seen with a Nazi salute. And
on the podium.
Yeah, on the podium. So part of that is obviously just in the environment in which they're in. That is what is done. But also there are potential sympathies there that we need to be aware of. And in some ways, some of Seaman's writings suggest that even if he is not a committed Nazi, he is sympathetic to some of the views that are being espoused.
Yeah, he's definitely, I'd call him a sympathetic follower. I'd say he definitely didn't have a problem with the Nazi regime. He approved, in one letter, Hitler's annexation of Austria. He liked the way that Hitler had rallied and reorganized Germany. But as you said, Mario, he never became a Nazi party member. And I do think underneath it all was just his raw ambition. He had wanted to win a Grand Prix since his youth, and this was the best way to do it, to join Mercedes, because the German teams just dominated it from 1934 onwards until the Second World War broke out.
Yeah, very clearly. And, let's not forget, he's well paid for his services as well. Interestingly, he's not allowed to take money out of the country, so it's kind of keeping him there, and whether the degree to which he feels claustrophobic, particularly as war is approaching, the Munich crisis and all sorts, is a little bit more difficult to establish. There's Earl Howe, one of his friends, also a racing driver of the 30s. There's a famous letter that Seaman writes to him asking some advice as to whether he should try and escape Germany and come back to Britain if war is to break out. In many ways, because of the famous Peace in Our Time, Neville Chamberlain kind of thing, he doesn't have to make that choice. Partly then because he dies in 1939 at the wheel of a Grand Prix car in Spa in Belgium.
Yeah.
Famously trying to beat Rudolf Caracciola, the Rainmeister, when it was pouring down with rain in Spa. And so that ambition, that drive, that desire to be the best, I think, is what fueled him more than anything. And that do or die attitude for Seaman, at least, ended up in death.
Yes, he crashed into a tree. He was terribly burnt. He lived for a few hours after the accident, but then he died. But to go on from what you said about this rivalry between Rudolf and Richard Seaman, I think also that's indicative of the Nazi preference for infighting between, just within Germany, between Germans. The Nazis, especially if you look at their style of rule, which in a nutshell was chaotic. Nazi Germany was a chaotic mess of bureaucratic infighting amongst different departments, different government ministers, and what have you, which is how Hitler wanted it, because in his mind, with his survival of the fittest social Darwinist ideology, the best solution is the one that will beat all of the others, is the one that will come out on top. So by all means, let's have this infighting, because in Hitler's warped psyche, that was nature, that was the way humanity worked. So in the same way, I think the rivalry between German race car drivers was again something that was so promoted by the Nazis because it was their vision of how all of society should be.
Yeah, and particularly between the two teams, right?
Yeah.
Between Mercedes and Auto Union. Within the teams themselves, there was a hierarchy to an extent, but based more on talent and skill than necessarily team orders per se. The drivers were allowed to race each other and did race each other quite hard at times. And
that's kind of the other side. Again, like fascist Italy, being a technocrat was a big part of Nazism's ideals and values, and the ideal, if we talk about the ideal Nazi man, being a technocrat is definitely there.
And even when Mussolini, and we come back to this nationalist kind of ideal, even when the Italians made up a new ruling for the 1939 Tripoli Grand Prix, their big event in Africa, to limit the engine size to 1.5 liters, because they thought that would exclude the German cars from being able to compete, because their engine displacement was much larger than that. It would allow the Italians to win. Even then, money was poured in to develop in secret special Mercedes cars that complied to the rules that the Italians were putting on this race in 1939. And these cars get shipped over, and it's a real surprise to the Italians to find that there are these Mercedes that turn up for the 1939 Tripoli Grand Prix. They race once and once alone, and they absolutely dominate the event. And again, just show German superiority over the Italian regime. It is the real kick in the teeth. And all of this is fueled by finance, by infighting, by a period of sustained success that these teams are used to.
And of course, like almost anything really that he did pre-war, at the back of Hitler's mind in his promotion of the automotive industry and of German motorsport was the idea to use it as a smokescreen for rearmament, because he told car manufacturers like Mercedes, I will give you all of this money and patronage and support and propaganda, including for your racing team. In return, secretly, you design and build army trucks, army vehicles. You become one of my armories as part of my rearmament policy, which, in my opinion, at the end of the day, drove most of the Nazi policies, rearmament, whenever you can, however you can. That was, I think, their overriding objective to prepare Germany for war, and they did it here as well.
Automotive industry, right the way through to aeroplane engines, all the way through to Dr. Ferdinand Porsche, who is the designer of the Auto Union car. He goes on to design some quite famous tanks that people might have heard of, the Tiger tanks for one. So, there are very clear links. It's a quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Here I've funded you, Mercedes, I funded you, Auto Union, to success in the Grand Prix arena. Now it's your turn to deliver on that expertise and that production capability for my army.
Well, it's even the Beetle design in 1937 was built in such a way that it could have a machine gun mounted on the front. Just everything comes back to how will this help us win in war?
Yeah.
And this was no different. It's promotion of motorsport. So I think as much as the propaganda value and Hitler's kind of personal interest in German motorsport victory, I do think this was the main motivation, the long-term feeling behind all of this Nazi promotion of motorsport, the idea that it could become a smokescreen, a catalyst, if you like, for rearmament and to create new military vehicles.
Yeah, and we've already mentioned also the autobahns and the military purpose to which they are going to be put as well.
Yeah.
I think absolutely this is a smokescreen that very much allows for rearmament to take center stage. And by the outbreak of war, you have a pretty mechanized German force that goes to victory in 1939 in Poland, and then famously through the Low Countries and France in 1940, spearheaded by new technology, by tanks, by armored vehicles, by trucks. Clearly the spearheading elements come from this technocratic buildup of machinery over the past sort of 5-6 years.
Yeah, and not just in terms of the technological or the mechanical side of motorsport, the car drivers and all of the crews and the teams that are behind them, they become folded into this idea of preparing for war. Again, a lot of the racing associations become linked to organizations like the SS, and ranks and uniforms. It was militarized, effectively, Germany's racing industry.
It was, and as we mentioned earlier, when the German teams first appeared, very clearly there was a stark contrast between them, the militarized organization, compared to everyone else. So I think very much that institutionalization of order and precision that comes with military service is embedded into the culture of the motor racing teams.
Yeah. I should say at this point that there were quite a lot of moments where motorsport didn't play ball with the fascist regime. It wasn't a complete rollover in terms of the welding of motorsport with fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. And there are a number of stories of both drivers and events that go against this trend. I mean, having just said that, I would still say that the poisonous ultra-nationalistic atmosphere of the late 1930s in Europe, when more and more people came round to the idea that a continent-wide war would probably happen again quite soon, displayed by the fact that in the 1936 Grand Prix in France, the French expelled the Italian national teams because of their invasion of Abyssinia that same year.
Oh yeah.
and the French Popular Front government, a leftist sort of socialist coalition, again offered 1 million francs for a French team who could create a car that could realistically challenge the Silver Arrows. So it wasn't just the fascist regimes who were getting in on this. Grand Prix became such a catalyst through which European nations could compete with each other and compete dangerously in a dangerous thing.
Yeah, and France, as an example, produces a number of fantastic racing drivers and really interesting cars at the time to compete. They're not quite of the same ilk as the Mercedes and Auto unions, but given the right circumstances, such as the French Grand Prix in '36, they're able to emerge victorious. They're able to claim this £1 million franc prize. And you mentioned upsets and Motorsport not playing ball a few minutes ago. I think the Grand Prix you're referring to is the 1938 Po Grand Prix.
Yes, this is the big one with René Dreyfus.
René Dreyfus, again, another one of France's premier drivers pre-war, who beat the Silver Arrows at their own game around the twisty streets of Po in southwest France. And this has added resonance because Dreyfus is Jewish. So obviously, very clearly with the Nazi regime, this doesn't go down particularly well. He's driving for Delahaye, which is a French car manufacturer. Dreyfus initially does sign up for military service with the French, but is excused duty nominally to go and race in the States in early 1940, but then is basically encouraged to stay there just in case. But given his language skills, it signs up for military service in the US as well and continues to sort of play his part. But that 38 Po Grand Prix, where a French car and a French driver and a Jewish French driver at that beats the German cars is an important one. This is just an interesting point to raise about the French drivers, is that a number of them end up fighting against the Nazi regime during the war itself. Some of them with pretty dire consequences. Robert Benoit is executed for his role as a resistance leader at Buchenwald in 1944. Another Anglo-French driver by the name of Williams, who wins the inaugural Monaco Grand Prix in 1929, becomes an SOE agent. And is another one who meets his end at Sachsenhausen in 1945. Jean-Pierre Wimille, who arguably is France's preeminent pre-war driver, is also involved in the resistance movement against Nazi Germany. So there's an interesting friction and dichotomy. So while motor racing, could bring people together, when war breaks out, very clearly, there are differences and people have very strong convictions about what's going on and are prepared in that devil-may-care attitude or that daredevil way to risk their lives doing something else, in this case, fighting for causes that are close to their hearts.
Yeah. And it goes without saying that not all of the German and Italian publics, including a lot of auto racing fans, and there were many in both countries, not all of them subscribed to these kind of fascist ideals around motorsport, especially when Materassi was killed in a crash during a race in 1928. There was a big backlash. The regime had to move quickly to stop this spiraling into a scandal, because members of the Vatican and other members of the liberal press, which back then hadn't yet been crushed out, although they were well on the way to that, but they accused the fascist organisers of putting speed and, thrill above that of safety, because several spectators were killed, including a young couple who were embracing when when Materasi's car hit and killed them. So it's that created quite a scandal for them, and the Vatican accused the regime of effectively trying to create this new sort of pagan religion, worship of speed and worship of this new fascist man. So, auto racing fans did not necessarily translate into fascist supporters in either countries.
No, no, not all the time. And there's always going to be dissent, whether it's able to be aired overtly or not. That's always present. And it's amazing how quickly the propaganda machine had to kick into action in 1928
Yes.
in order to appropriate the narrative into the fascist regime, as opposed to allowing the liberal press or those who wanted to close down motorsports, which, by the way, wasn't in a great spot as a in 1928, 1929, 1930, particularly as a result
No.
of the Wall Street crash. Like, Italy and the fascist regime almost propped it up. So there was a real risk that the haters of motorsport, if you will, would be able to kind of close it
Well,
down.
there were a lot of Italians who said, "What is the point of all of this?" Because quite a number of Italian drivers were being killed. And they
Yeah.
were thinking, "What is the point of all of this tragedy?" And it was the regime and its propaganda gurus who kind of said, "Right, the language you've got to promote here is the fact that we're moving towards technical progress."
Yeah, and the counter argument always is that technical progress, that what you see on the racetrack now, you will see on the road car in 2 or 3 years' time, that there will be a trickle down effect.
The legacy of all of this is still very much present. Monza is still used. That was built by fascist Italy.
Yeah,
And it was
yeah,
built for fascist Italy to
and
promote their architecture and their megalomania. So
and it's still known as the Temple of Speed.
yeah,
Right?
yeah.
And so that the wording of that harps back to
Mm.
exactly what fascist Italy were after.
Yeah. Not that this really needs to be said, but at the end of the day, both fascist regimes, like everything else that they came into contact with, utterly destroyed it. Obviously, motor racing in Europe was halted for the duration of the Second World War, and German and Italian motorsport was torn apart and destroyed, as their countries were, thanks to the fascist regimes. So, in terms of the end game of all of this, despite all of their promotion and patronage, like everything else in their respective countries, they took it to hell in a handcart. But briefly, I think both regimes saw motorsport as one of the ultimate expressions of masculinity, technical and racial superiority, and living violently, living dangerously, and winning whatever the cost.
Yeah, absolutely. It encompasses all of the elements of the regime that both of them wanted to put forward as being the new way. But out of the ashes emerges a new motorsport with a new history and a new legacy that rarely, in some ways, looks to that pre-war era that we've just
Yeah,
discussed,
yeah.
Jonathan, which is quite interesting in its own right. Formula
Well,
One looks to 1950 as the start point, but I think for the aficionado, for those with an interest in motorsport history, who maybe don't know about the pre-war era, I hope they found this interesting, and I would encourage them to go and look into it a little bit more, because Grand Prix racing predates Formula One and
yes.
1950.
And what the fascist regimes brought into motorsport is still here today. Professionalization, celebrity status of drivers, and several other aspects are still there in Formula One, and are actually core aspects of Formula One. They're integral now. So
yeah, not to mention the venues, of course, some of which are still
exactly. Well, thank you so much, Mario, for joining me today to talk about fascism and motorsport. I hope everyone enjoyed listening to this episode, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.
All right, thank you.